We meet today in freedom's cause and raise our voices high. We'll join our hands in union strong to battle or to die. Those are the stirring strains of the Union song, Hold the Fort, an appropriate song for our subject. Greetings, my name is Marilyn Vogt-Downey. I will host this segment of WBAI's special broadcast celebrating the centenary of the Russian Revolution. In this portion of the program, we will talk about the impact that the Russian Revolution had in the United States on the unionization of the U.S. working class. The October 1917 Russian Revolution was an event that truly shook the world. It demonstrated that a Marxist party could lead the workers and poor peasants and soldiers to take power, abolish capitalism, and govern themselves. The ruling capitalist classes across the planet were terrified, of course, by this development and soon mobilized militarily to try to crush the revolution. But the workers across the world were inspired by this revolutionary example, and many wanted to make their own revolutions. The Bolsheviks organized a new communist international in Moscow in March 1919 to harness all this popular energy into new communist parties to hopefully turn the Russian Revolution into a world revolution. They wanted to end capitalist exploitation everywhere, and they knew that socialism could not be built in one country. What kind of impact did the Russian Revolution have on workers in the United States and their aspirations and struggles for a better life and a better world? We will review this remarkable and largely buried history with historian Sharon Smith, author of a book called Subterranean Fire, A History of Working Class Radicalism in the United States, published by Haymarket Books. Sharon is also the author of Women and Socialism, Class, Race, and Capital. She writes regularly for Socialist Worker newspaper and the International Socialist Review. Sharon is a leading member of the International Socialist Organization. She is a socialist and an activist. Greetings, Sharon. Thank you for taking part in this program.
Thank you, Marilyn. My pleasure.
Your study provides a remarkable history and analysis of a critical concern of ours and our focus, union organizing in the United States. How the Russian Revolution affected the struggle of U.S. workers for the most basic form of working class organization, a union. Let us start with the before. What have been the general results of union organizing efforts in the United States up until the Russian Revolution of 1917?
Well, Marilyn, I'm sure most people aren't surprised to know that the U.S. capitalist class has always fought tooth and nail to prevent workers from organizing into unions. In fact, the U.S. is unique in the sheer level of violence that employers use to crush strikes and union organizing drives historically. The biggest corporations hired their own private armies of strike breakers to defeat workers when they went out on strike, shooting and killing them if necessary. In Ludlow, Colorado in 1914, just one example, John D. Rockefeller's private army opened fire on striking families asleep in their tents in the early morning hours and then set the whole tent colony on fire. 13 women and children burned to death in that one incident, and 3 strikers were executed on the spot. There are many, many such examples in our history.
Well, how did the U.S. government respond? Did it take the side of the capitalists or of the workers, Sharon?
The corporations pretty much could always call on local and state governments and police, even the National Guard, when they needed help, to give the company overwhelming force against the workers. Meanwhile, the courts were more than happy to declare any work stoppage illegal simply by passing an injunction against it, as happened in the 1894 Pullman strike, for example. This extraordinary degree of repression and violence meant that, in spite of the high level of working class struggle in the U.S., By 1917, the vast majority of unskilled workers had no union representation or workplace rights.
Well, describe for us then some of the reverberations across the United States of working class seizure of power in Russia.
The impact of the Russian Revolution was enormous all over the world, and the U.S. was no exception. However, the socialist movement itself was divided in 1917. Tens of thousands of immigrant workers flooded into the Socialist Party, in particular its foreign language federations, after the Russian Revolution, only to find out that the party's leadership was against the revolution. At the same time, U.S. workers had gained tremendous confidence thanks to the Russian Revolution, seeing a workers' government in power, and the class struggle exploded in 1918. 4 million workers took part in strikes in 1919, and by 1920, the organized labor movement was twice the size it had been 5 years earlier in the U.S. Labor parties were formed in 40 cities around the country. The high point of the class struggle was definitely the Seattle General Strike in February 1919, when 65,000 striking workers took over the running of the city of Seattle for 6 days in what was a conscious identification with the Russian Revolution. About 6 months later, Seattle dock workers refused to load weapons that were intended to be used to overthrow the Russian workers' government, and they beat up strikebreakers who tried to load those weapons.
Oh, good. And the Communist Party was formed. Would you please describe the origins of the U.S. Communist Party?
Well, the Communist Party was actually born out of a split in the Socialist Party. Some of its members, as I mentioned, supported the Russian Revolution while the leadership opposed it. So at the party's 1919 convention, a majority of its members supported the revolution and wanted to affiliate with the Communist International, which you mentioned earlier, Marilyn. To avoid losing the vote, Socialist Party leaders just expelled 2/3 of its membership, which was about 50,000 members. Now, unfortunately, those who were expelled from the Socialist Party immediately split into two competing organizations. In 1921, the Communist International finally convinced them to merge into a single Communist Party.
Uh-huh. How did the U.S. ruling class respond then to this radicalization of the workers?
The U.S. ruling class was intent on crushing the Russian workers' government, as you described in your introduction, Marilyn, but it was also intent on stamping out working class opposition at home. And to this end, the U.S. government joined with corporate leaders to launch an all-out anti-communist Red Scare directed at radical workers of all stripes, socialists, communists, anarchists, and so on. In Butte, Montana in 1917, just as one example, mine owners arranged the lynching of IWW organizer Frank Little, whose mutilated body was found hanging from a railroad bridge. In 1919, Congress created the American Legion, which was an armed wing of the American Association of Manufacturers, to help crush the escalating strike wave. Many states outlawed the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, and the Socialist Party. Street meetings were banned. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer worked with J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI to raid radical offices in 12 cities in November 1919. These were known as the Palmer raids. They arrested 2,000 radicals in New York City alone. In 1920 in Boston, 500 people were arrested and shackled and then paraded through the streets.
What was the impact of all this on the communist parties then? All these attacks.
Palmer raids virtually destroyed local Communist Party organizations. Many thousands of immigrants were deported for belonging to a radical organization. Even to call for a strike was banned. All of this aimed at stamping out the working class struggle. And you know what? It worked. By 1929, the American Federation of Labor had lost 1 million members.
Dear. During these years, also, racist Jim Crow segregation was at its height. You write that the Socialist Party at that time had a strong segregationist position, as did the American Federation of Labor. How did the Russian Revolution and the rise of the Communist Party change things?
The Socialist Party contained open segregationists in its membership, even within its leadership at that time, when Jim Crow segregation was flourishing and lynching was the order of the day. Now, not all Socialist Party members were this extreme, but the Socialist Party never took a stand against Jim Crow segregation or lynching. It was only with the formation of the Communist Party, which was racially integrated from its beginning, that the socialist movement developed a strong anti-racist tradition in the United States. The party formally pledged to, in its words, to make the struggle on behalf of the Negro masses one of its major tasks, end quote.
Sharon Smith, would you describe, in line with this, following up on this, would you describe for us, as you did in your book, in particular, the Communist Party's campaign to organize Alabama sharecroppers?
Well, the Communist Party sent 3 white organizers to Birmingham, Alabama in 1929 to organize a union among black and white sharecroppers there. It was, keep in mind, it was illegal in Alabama at that time to even advocate for equality between black and white people. And the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, actively organized against the communists. And with the help of the local police, they beat, lynched, and murdered activists. However, by 1935, the union claimed almost 10,000 members. It's no exaggeration to say that the Communist Party provided a role model for building a multiracial socialist organization and was really exceptional for its time.
Why do you state in your book, Subterranean Fire, that the Depression decade was a turning point for the working class? What was different in the 1930s, and what did the Russian Revolution have to do with this difference?
Well, the Great Depression, of course, threw a large portion of workers into unemployment and poverty. This then led to a sharp rise in class struggle, and most of these struggles were led by radicals. So in 1934, for example, the Toledo Auto Light strike was led by A.J. Muste, who was the leader of the American Workers' Party, and that strike drew the city's massive unemployed workers into supporting the strike instead of taking jobs as strike breakers. There was also the Minneapolis Teamsters strike, led by Trotskyists, that is, communists who had been expelled from the Communist Party for supporting the left opposition, led by Leon Trotsky, who you mentioned earlier. These Trotskyists led strikes that turned Minneapolis into a union town and transformed the Teamsters Union into a national union of over-the-road drivers. Thirdly, the San Francisco general strike that was led by Harry Bridges, who was a close supporter of the Communist Party, led to a broad union recognition there. What was most important about these strikes, especially in Minneapolis and San Francisco, was how democratically they were run. By 1937, the confidence of the working class had advanced tremendously, and the sit-down strike against General Motors in Flint, Michigan, maybe the most important strike in U.S. history, which was, again, led by communists and socialists, ended in victory when General Motors finally recognized the United Auto Workers Union. These victories opened the floodgates for unionization in this country.
And led to, as you described, led to a dramatic transformation of the union movement in this country from being based on craft unionism to being based on industrial unionism. Would you describe that development and what it meant for the workers?
Sure. Before the 1930s, the main union federation, as mentioned earlier, was the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, which almost exclusively organized skilled workers by craft. Its leaders were conservative, racist, and sexist, and with just a few exceptions, they literally refused to organize unskilled workers at all. The few black workers they did allow in were forced into racially segregated locals. Auto workers were literally flooding into the AFL, for example, in the early 1930s, only to flood right back out when they realized that they were put into separate locals with fewer rights than skilled workers. So at the time was ripe for organizing industrial unions. That is, unions that represented the entire workforce in a factory instead of just the skilled trades. It was in that context and under pressure from workers that some union officials split from the AFL to form what eventually became the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or the CIO. When the CIO opened its doors, it immediately became the vehicle for industrial union organizing, from auto workers to rubber workers and eventually steel workers. The CIO was far from perfect, but it did mark a turning point for the U.S. working class, and this was largely due to radicals inspired by the Russian Revolution and the very existence of the Soviet Union as what they viewed as an alternative system.
How did the pro-worker legislative reforms under Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s fit into this history?
Well, Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office at this very time when the U.S. capitalist system was facing a crisis for its survival, with the obvious possibility that the working class could also pose a threat to its existence. FDR himself said, "I'm the best friend the capitalist system ever had." Those are his words. He tried to straddle basically between granting a minimum set of reforms and stabilizing the system in favor of the corporate class.
Then came World War II, and we will fast forward to the early 1950s, but more than one-third, around 34% of the workers in the United States were in unions, an all-time high. Today, the percentage of workers in unions has dropped to almost one-third of that, roughly what it was 100 years ago before the Russian Revolution. And the standard of living of the working class in the U.S. is on the decline. What happened?
Well, the dramatic growth of unions in the 1930s tipped the balance of class forces in this country in favor of workers for the first time. And the U.S. ruling class immediately began searching for a way to shift things back in its favor. Radicals had played a key role in leading the successful class struggles of the 1930s, as I mentioned, and these radicals had to be stopped. The anti-communist witch hunt was initiated in the late 1930s and escalated in the 1950s to get rid of these radicals. The McCarthy era is remembered most in popular culture for attacks on Hollywood celebrities by the fanatical Senator Joe McCarthy that was showcased by the hearings of the House Un-American Activities Committee. But they were not the main victims. Thousands of socialists, communists, and union militants were driven out of their jobs and their unions by these anti-communist witch hunts. McCarthyism, therefore, physically removed radicals from the American labor movement, and with them, any memory of the role and successful class struggle tactics of socialists and other radicals in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. The long-term effect of McCarthyism has been to erase this history and the lessons of the mass struggles that built the union movement.
As we wind up, 100 years after the Russian Revolution, we seem to be back where we started in many ways in terms of the unionization of workers. Will it take another Russian Revolution, Sharon, to move us forward again? What do you think?
Well, it's significant that today we're witnessing the growth of a new interest in socialism and the potential for it to play a key role in the future class struggle. On the other hand, we've just endured 40 years of a one-sided class war in this country. The Soviet Union's collapse back in the early 1990s was widely alleged to mean that socialism is impossible. Now, we know that is not the case. An understanding of the class struggle among workers that the Russian Revolution inspired 100 years ago needs to be revived. Remember, capitalism is based on a system of struggle between two antagonistic classes, the capitalist class and the working class. This antagonism, this struggle exists as long as capitalism exists. Either the workers will learn to unite in solidarity across borders, that is globally, as the Marxists in Russia taught 100 years ago, or the living standards of U.S. workers will continue to fall to approximate the poorest workers of the world. A positive outcome will require rebuilding a class struggle current inside the U.S. labor organizations and movements. This is the challenge that really has to be met by Marxists and by all socialists in the United States today.
And this is a big challenge indeed, but it does offer hope and a way forward. So I want to thank you very much for your insights and information. This is an important
Marilyn.
history that you have brought out. Thank you so much. And I want to remind listeners that we're listening to Sharon Smith, author of Subterranean Fire, A History of Working Class Radicalism in the United States. It's such an amazing book that everyone should read to find out this history that's been basically suppressed with very damaging impact on working class in this country. How can people contact you if they want to learn more about your work?
Anyone can contact me through haymarketbooks.org, and I'd be happy to hear from people. Thank you so much, Marilyn. This has been wonderful.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. Thank you so much.